All right, this is lab number 10 on WebLogic clusters. In this lab, we are going to learn how to configure a cluster, how to deploy resources to that cluster, and manage that cluster. And we're also going to configure a simple proxy that will load balance requests across the cluster. So we're going to deploy an application to the cluster after we've configured it. Then we're going to have a proxy in front of that will load balance requests from across two different WebLogic managed servers. So in this lab, the way I have the lab set up, I assume that you only have one server that you're working on, probably your desktop or your laptop. So there's ways for us to fool WebLogic into thinking that there are more machines in the environment and not just the one that you're actually working on. First things first, we're going to create some managed servers in our WebLogic server domain. So we're still using the example domain that came with WebLogic when we ran the Quick Start Wizard. So we're going to modify this domain to include 3 additional managed servers, 2 of which are going to be clustered, 1 is going to be standalone. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up a terminal window and start the admin server for the WL server domain. Okay, so once the server's up and running, we'll get that lousy pop-up again. Going to cancel. If you recall, we applied a security policy to the example web application that automatically loads when this domain starts up, and it just prompted me to log in. So I'm going to cancel out of that. But let's go ahead and log into the admin console. And if you remember, we configured the domain-wide admin port recently, so we have to access this using HTTPS and the admin port, which is 9001/console. Yes, accept the certificate. Okay, so once, go ahead and log in as WebLogic. Okay, so there's a table in the lab guide that lists all the parameters, all the server names, listen addresses, and ports that we need to configure the managed servers. So let's go ahead and create those 3 managed servers right now. So under Environment, click on Servers, click New, and first we'll create Managed Server 1. And so in the managed server lab, when we created a managed server, we only specified the server name and the listen port. We left listen address blank. And what that does is it tells WebLogic to bind to any listen address available. And so you can see in the server log when WebLogic's starting up, when the managed server is starting up, that it binds to several different addresses. You'll see 127.0.0.1, you'll see your DHCP IP address from your router, and then there may be an IPv6 address or a hardware address. So moving forward, we are going to define a listen address for these servers. You can either use the host name of your machine, or I'd recommend just using the IP address of your machine. So I'm going to use my IP address, which is 192.168.1.150. And if you're not sure how to get your IP address, if you're in Windows, open up a command window and type ipconfig. Or if you're in Linux or Mac OS X, you can do an ifconfig. Okay, so put in the IP address of your machine and use the table to specify the listen port. So for MS1, it's 8002. And notice this option down here. Should this server belong to a cluster? Yes, it should belong to a cluster, but don't specify yes here. We'll actually create the cluster manually after we've created the managed servers. So go ahead and click Next and then Finish. Now let's go ahead and create MS2. Now do the same for MS2. And do the same for MS3. Okay, so now that we've created the 3 managed servers, we need to configure the local admin port for each one of these servers. So recall, since we've enabled the domain-wide admin port, each managed server must also define its own admin port. Right now, since we're running these managed servers all on the same machine, the default admin port is 9002. So if we were to start up MS1, MS2, and MS3, MS1 may be able to bind to 9002, but then MS2 is going to try to bind to 9002, and so is MS3, and they won't be able to. And so they won't be able to connect to the admin server. So we need to change that. So go ahead and click on MS1. And then scroll down on the General tab, and under Advanced, find the Local Administration Port Override and specify the value that's in the lab guide table. So for MS1, it actually is 9002. So go ahead and leave that alone and go back to Servers and click on MS2. Scroll down and click on Advanced and see that it's also 9002. This is the default domain-wide admin port. Change this to 9003. Click Save. And then repeat this for the managed server 3. So click on MS3, scroll down under Advanced, and local admin port should be 9004, and click Save. So now that we've configured the local admin port for all the managed servers, we can now go ahead and actually create the cluster. You can create the cluster first. The order doesn't necessarily matter. I like to create my managed servers first and then my cluster, but you can do it either way. So to create a cluster, go under domain structure here, and under environment you see clusters. Click on clusters. And then click the new button, and we're going to create a standard cluster. So let's go ahead and name our cluster. Now I'd refer to the table in the lab guide that defines the cluster parameters. So demo cluster is our name. And if you recall from the lecture, there were 2 messaging modes. There's unicast and multicast. For this lab, we're going to use multicast. It's much easier to set up. Go ahead and leave the unicast broadcast channel blank. WebLogic will automatically define one. And click OK. That's it. Your cluster is created. There's nothing in it right now, but we'll change that in just a second. So let's go ahead and click on Demo Cluster. And on the General tab, one of the first things you'll see is the default load algorithm. So by default, load balancing in this cluster is going to be round robin. You can see that there's weight based, so we can assign weights to each cluster member. And WebLogic will load balance based on those weights. There's random, so requests will be randomly assigned to cluster members. And then there are these affinity-based algorithms as well. And if we click on the Servers tab and scroll down to the bottom here, we'll see that right now there are no servers in our cluster. So let's go ahead and change that. Click the Add button and select MS1 and click Finish. And scroll back down, you'll see that MS1 has now been added to the cluster. Click Add again, and then select MS2 and click Finish. And so now, scroll down to the bottom, now we have MS1 and MS2 in our cluster. MS3 is going to be a standalone server. We are not going to add it to the cluster. And the reason for that is that MS3 is going to act as our load balancer, as our proxy. So now that we've added MS1 and MS2 to our cluster, let's go ahead and start our cluster. So when you hear start the cluster, what that really means is start all the cluster members that are in that cluster. So let's go back to our terminal window and open up a new shell. And we're going to need one for MS1 and another one for MS2. So let's go ahead and start that managed server. And if you recall, the syntax to do that is start, and you've got to be in the domain home bin directory. So looking at my terminal window, for me that's U01, Udemy, domains, WL server/bin, and in there is the start manage WebLogic script. It's in the same location as the same script you would use to start the admin server. So the syntax to start up a managed server, to refresh your memory, takes two parameters. One is the name of the managed server that you're starting, which is MS1, and then the URL to the admin server. Now, you may recall that in the past we've used T3 localhost 7001. We can't use that now that we've got the domain-wide admin port configured. So we've got to use T3S secure, and then we can use localhost since the admin server is still responding to localhost, and then 9001, which is the admin port for the admin server. And go ahead and hit enter. So what just happened? We're prompted to enter a username to boot WebLogic server, to boot MS1. Why did it come up now and not when we started the admin server? We were never prompted to enter a username and password for the admin server. Well, when you run the configuration wizard, or you create a domain using WebLogic scripting tool, you specify the admin username and password during domain creation time. WebLogic creates what's called a boot.properties file for the admin server automatically. It does not, however, create one for the managed server. So let's go ahead and do that now. And this is something that we covered in the managed servers lab. So hopefully this is just a refresher for you. So to create that boot.properties file, we've got to go into the domain home/servers directory. And in here, there should be an MS1 directory. Yep, okay. So we need to make a security directory underneath MS1. And inside security, we need to create a boot.properties text file. So I'm just going to do I'm just going to VI boot.properties here. And if you recall, this takes two lines that define the username and password. So username equals WebLogic, password equals WebLogic123. Go ahead and save the file. And I'm going to cheat a little bit. This isn't in the lab guide. But if you have multiple managed servers on the same machine, the same VM or physical host, you can actually copy the boot.properties file to other managed servers that are on that same machine. You don't need to create it by hand every time for each managed server. You can just copy the boot.properties file around. And that only works when you're on the same VM or physical machine. If the managed servers were scattered remotely on different machines, we wouldn't be able to do that. So let's go ahead and create the MS2 directory while we're here. And then copy the security directory from MS1 over. Okay, so there it is. All right, so we should be good to go to start these servers up now. So let's go back and start the managed server. Okay, so you can see here that MS1 has started successfully. It's in a running state. Also note that we now see cluster messages in our server output. And you can find those cluster messages by noting this right here, this log element, cluster. And you can see that this server is now listening for announcements from the cluster using unicast cluster messaging. So right now, MS1 is the only cluster member running. And so by default, it is actually the cluster master. The master is responsible for coordinating cluster activities. So leave this running, open up another terminal window, and start MS2. And you should see the same output that you saw with MS1. So now that the server's in a running state, we can see that it's listening for announcements from the cluster. And if you look further above, we can also verify that the boot identity was stored in boot.properties. And that's this message right here. Okay, so let's go back to the admin console and click on the servers tab. Click on servers underneath environment and domain structure and take a look at your servers table. So your admin server, MS1 and MS2 should be running and healthy. So now that we have servers running within a cluster, let's go ahead and deploy resources to that cluster. The first thing that we're going to do, we're going to retarget one of the example data sources to the cluster. So doing so will make that data source highly available. So to do that, let's go back and under services, under domain structure, click on data sources, and then click on the examples demo data source. And on the targets tab, let's go ahead and target this data source to demo cluster. You can see here that MS3 is listed as a server. These are standalone servers, non-clustered servers. And then in the clusters box, we have our demo cluster, but then we've got the option to deploy the resource to all servers in the cluster or part of the cluster. If I were to specify part of the cluster, that data source would not be clustered per se. At this point, we would treat MS1 or MS2 as standalone servers. So we want to check the box for demo cluster and accept the default of all servers in the cluster, and also leave the data source on the admin server as well. So go ahead and click save. And once we've done that, the data source is now applied to the cluster and replicated to each of the cluster members. So to verify that, we can actually test this data source on each of the cluster members. So go ahead and click on the monitoring tab. And you can see here under the deployed instances table that we have an instance of this data source running on admin server, MS1, and MS2. So go ahead and click on the testing tab and test the data source on each one of these servers. Okay, so each one of these returned successful. So this examples demo data source is now clustered. It is highly available. If I had an application that was looking up this data source from a JNDI tree, and if any one of these servers were to fail, it would not impact the application. So if for some reason the application was connected to MS1's data source and MS1 failed, WebLogic would fail over that database connection to another data source on a healthy server at MS2. So what we're going to do now is we're going to deploy an application to the cluster, and we're going to use that main web app example application. But what I want to do is I want to start from scratch. So go ahead and delete the main web app because we defined that security policy for the application, and I want to get rid of it and start fresh. So we're going to go ahead and delete it.